Good morning. I'm Harry Fine. I'm a former adjudicator of the Landlord Tenant Board in Ontario and a licensed paralegal. I've been practicing this area of law for 15 years and I'm considered one of the top in the province. I wanted to give landlords a little perspective today with what's happening with the coronavirus, the closing of the courts, tenant issues you may have, and how you might want to deal with them. The bad news is, and the honest news is, there's no answer for you now. The government is looking at tenants and suggesting to them that they won't be evicted. The government has closed the Landlord Tenant Board, pretty much. You can still file an application, but you won't get a hearing for eviction. If you have an existing eviction order, it won't be enforced. If you have a hearing that's been heard that could lead to eviction, an eviction order won't be issued. So in terms of eviction, which is how landlords enforce tenant obligations, there isn't going to be any in the foreseeable future. How long, of course, nobody knows. I see a lot of landlords posting online, I have a tenant who's not paying rent, I have a tenant who's acting in a certain way, I have a tenant who's causing damage, I have a tenant who won't let me in to inspect. One of the things landlords should realize now, assuming that the Residential Tenancies Act applies to your tenancy, is that you have no power. You have no power to collect rent. You have no power to force tenants to move out. For a landlord who's considering selling their property now to a prospective purchaser, even that's difficult because a prospective purchaser is not going to want to buy your house tenanted or condo tenanted. And if they want to move in, that's pretty much impossible because the tenant's there and there's no way to evict them even with the proper process. So I hear people online giving advice like, serve an N12, tell them you're moving in for your own use. None of that is going to be effective. In terms of rent, the provincial government and Justin Trudeau at the federal level have said, tenants, you won't be evicted. What's happened because of that message and because of the closing of the Landlord Tenant Board eviction process in Ontario is that tenants simply, many of them who are unemployed, who've had their hours cut, won't pay their rent. Many tenants will take advantage of this opportunity to not pay their rent. And one of the problems is that neither Trudeau nor Ford here in Ontario have been clear about what it means, don't pay your rent, or you won't be evicted, I should say. What does it mean? I mean, does it mean that you'll never have to pay this rent? Does it mean that you'll have to catch up on the rent? Nobody knows. Tenants have this sort of guilt-free rent strike going on now in Ontario. Guilt-free because they've been led to believe that landlords won't have to pay their mortgages, which just isn't true. There'll be some mortgage deferral, but many banks are not allowing it. They're not allowing it for investment properties. They're not allowing it for properties that aren't your principal residence. They're not allowing it based on whether you've prepaid, whether your mortgage payment is on track or ahead of track. There's all sorts of conditions. So landlords will have their expenses go on. Even if there were no mortgage payments, there's, in some cases, utilities where rent is all in. There's taxes, there's insurance, there's maintenance. In condos, there's common element fees. And the government hasn't given landlords any assurance that they're going to be protected in some way. There's a rent strike going on starting April 1st across Ontario, started by a group called Parkdale Organize. I'm not criticizing them. That's their constituency is tenants who are going to have a problem paying rent. But the message they're getting from the government has empowered them to create this movement called, don't pay your rent April 1st. So what will landlords do? I don't know. The only thing you can do right now is talk to your MPP, talk to the Mayor of Toronto if it's in Toronto, and tell them that it's just not appropriate to suggest to tenants they won't be evicted without, on the other hand, sending a message that you will have to pay this rent at some point. Another alternative, of course, is for the governments who are going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars in pumping money into various sectors of the economy throughout this coronavirus crisis to pump some into tenants' rents and create rent banks or create a process where landlord and tenant can verify rent is owing and with documentation, copies of the lease, copies of perhaps an N4 notice to terminate the tenancy, copies of the tenant producing a layoff notice or proof of hours being reduced, and the government could then allow the tenant to draw from that rent bank to pay their rent, even a percentage of their rent. There has to be some solution that involves both landlords and tenants, and so far there's not. So far all we have is the government saying, don't worry about rent, and tenants organizations, whether it's ACTO, whether it's the Federation of Metro Tenants Associations, Acorn, Parkdale organized, they're saying, hey, rent strike April 1st. The signs are all around the city. The social media messages to tenants are, don't pay your rent. The Facebook tenant groups are saying, damn the landlords, they're rich, fat, and mean, and we shouldn't have to pay rent. So in summary, landlords, you won't be able to take difficult positions. Can you enter into the unit? Well, legally you can if you give 24 hours written notice. But if a tenant says, I'm quarantined, or I'm in a vulnerable category medically of catching the coronavirus, then you're going to have to take some extraordinary measures. You're going to have to work with your tenant, perhaps on different entry protocols, coming in with masks and gloves, cleaning your hands before you come in, one person at a time, picking a time where the tenants won't be there, or social distancing, or now they're calling it physical distancing, while you're in the unit. Because landlords do have a right to go in, they have an obligation to go in to keep things fixed. They have an obligation to go in to do fire safety inspections. And yet tenants are, in many cases now, simply saying you can't come in. So don't think for a moment about selling your property and evicting the tenant. It's not going to happen. When the Landlord-Tenant Board finally opens again, might be 10 months from now, there's going to be a year backlog in having applications heard at the board. There was already a 4 or 5 month backlog, and now whatever happens, if there's a 3 month, 4 month delay now, that'll add on those 4 months. But it'll add on a lot more, because if there's a rent strike April 1st, there's going to be hundreds, thousands of applications filed to the board that will overload the already overloaded system. People ask me, should I serve an N4 if rent isn't being paid? My answer is yes, but with a caveat. You want to serve an N4 and file the L1 application so that you can get into the long Landlord-Tenant Board queue when things get back to normal. Otherwise, it could take you a year, 2 years to get the matter heard, during which time rent isn't getting paid. But don't serve the N4 without a discussion with your tenant. A discussion that says something like, look, I'm serving you this N4 notice, not to evict you, but to get myself in the queue. I want to work with you. I want to try to work out some sort of payment plan where at least something gets paid. Once this crisis is over, I would certainly be willing to work out a plan so that there's rent paid plus a repayment of some of the outstanding each month until it's paid. We know this is tough for everybody, so please take this N4 notice, but know that I'm here to work with you. I'm just looking for you to work with me. So that's some quick advice. If you want to get more advice, you can contact me at my website, www.hfineparalegal.ca. I can give you some information and perhaps some quick advice, but frankly, there's not much that I or any paralegal can do at this point until we know where the government's going to go in terms of the Landlord-Tenant Board, forgiveness of rent, payment plans, etc. Best of luck.